In July 1840, the port of Veracruz was still living off a crime it had learned to call commerce. Ships arrived, human beings were counted, names were stripped away and replaced with Christian ones, as if a priest's ink could wash blood from a ledger. That summer was unusually hot on the Gulf Coast. The cane fields beyond the city were producing profit at full capacity, and men like Don Cristóbal Mendoza y Villarreal knew exactly how to turn heat, land, and captive bodies into wealth. San Miguel de las Palmas stood about 20 kilometers southwest of Veracruz, on land that would later fall within Medellín de Bravo. It was not a ruin then. It was an efficient machine. Stone walls, lime plaster, long corridors, 2 inner courtyards, 14 rooms, a family chapel, kitchens at the rear, servants' quarters packed behind the proper spaces reserved for those who claimed rank and decency. Like many estates of the period, it depended on the labor of the enslaved and the silence of everyone who benefited from it. In the 3rd week of July 1840, 18 enslaved Africans were taken from a ship recently docked at Veracruz and delivered inland to San Miguel. Among them was a young black woman, about 18 years old. The parish register records the name given to her after forced baptism, María Elena Gómez. That was not the name she was born with. That was the name imposed on her by the same order that chained her body and expected gratitude for saving her soul. This must be remembered clearly. Before the strange events, before the whispers, before the fear, there was a simpler obscenity. A girl was stolen, renamed, and absorbed into a plantation household as property. By August 1840, neighboring correspondents had already begun to mention her. One woman, Doña Carmen Estrada, described María Elena as striking enough to cause unrest among laborers and discomfort among the wives of overseers. Don Cristóbal made what some around him considered an imprudent decision. He did not send María Elena to the fields. He assigned her to domestic work inside the main house. That choice matters. The house was the nerve center of power at San Miguel. To be placed there was to move close to the books, the doors, the meals, the conversations, the rhythms of command. María Elena cleaned corridors, attended to rooms, maintained domestic order, but witnesses later agreed on one point that demands attention. She could read and write. In 1840 Veracruz, that alone made her dangerous to any system that depended on black ignorance as much as it depended on black labor. Literacy in a captive woman was not merely unusual. It was intolerable evidence that the hierarchy was built on force, not nature. Doña Esperanza Mendoza, wife of Don Cristóbal, reportedly noticed it early. For a time, she even considered using María Elena to help instruct the younger children. That never happened. Something changed before that could happen. Something in the house shifted, and it shifted fast. The first public rupture came on September 15, 1840, during the celebration of Mexican independence. San Miguel hosted a gathering that lasted from morning into the night. Laborers, house staff, neighboring visitors, local men of standing. All the usual faces of colonial society pretending to be civilized while resting on violence. María Elena was serving drinks when Don Aurelio Salinas, owner of nearby Hacienda La Esperanza, grabbed her arm. Accounts describe the gesture as forceful, improper, familiar in the way powerful men become when they believe no one can refuse them. What happened next entered testimony because it violated the expected order. María Elena did not cry out. She did not plead. She spoke to Don Aurelio in precise Spanish and told him to release her. Witnesses later said her tone was calm, almost unnervingly calm. And Don Aurelio, a man known for temper, arrogance, and mistreatment of workers, let go at once. No outburst, no insult, no retaliation. No. He stepped away in silence and spent the rest of the evening watching her from a distance, confused, as though something inside him had slipped out of place. That was the moment people later pointed to. Not because it proved anything supernatural. It proved something more disturbing. It showed that power, once confronted without fear, can hesitate. And when it hesitates, everyone nearby feels the tremor. By early October 1840, the tremor had become a pattern. The estate's major domo, Joaquín Herrera, began showing María Elena a deference that made no sense under plantation discipline. Decisions were being made without Don Cristóbal's usual direct control, and somehow, repeatedly, those decisions benefited the young woman brought to the hacienda in July. The shift was gradual enough to hide itself. That is how corruption often works. Not with one grand collapse, but with 100 daily adjustments. María Elena began doing more than cleaning. She moved into matters of domestic organization, then household direction, then questions that belonged to administration. Later review of the account books reportedly showed a change in the handwriting used in routine entries from October 1840 onward. The hand was no longer Don Cristobal's. By November 12, 1840, Doña Esperanza herself was alarmed. She wrote that her husband was no longer the man she had known. He was spending long hours speaking privately with María Elena about estate matters he had never before shared with his wife. When questioned afterward, he could not clearly explain what had been discussed. That detail should not be softened. A slave-holding husband who had spent years excluding his wife from real power was now turning from her toward an enslaved black woman for counsel. Whether one calls it manipulation, dependence, obsession, or judgment, the result was the same. The old order had begun to rot from inside. Servants noticed it too. A cook named Remedios Vasquez later described how María Elena's authority spread through the house like rising water. At first, the workers resisted taking instructions from someone of her status. Then, without fully noticing when the line had been crossed, they obeyed her. That is how San Miguel changed in the autumn of 1840. Not with open revolt, not with legal decree, but with one obedience after another. By December, even the church had begun to record the contamination. Father Antonio Maldonado, who came to officiate Mass in the family chapel, observed laborers looking toward María Elena during worship with an attentiveness they should have directed toward the altar. He saw them waiting for tiny signs from her before responding in ritual. He noted her own bearing as unusually upright, composed, confident beyond what the plantation expected from an enslaved woman. That word matters, expected. Men like Maldonado could tolerate cruelty more easily than they could tolerate the collapse of assigned posture, and so the record darkens. This is not merely a story about beauty or mystery, it is a story about a slave regime that mistook domination for permanence. In July 1840, they thought they were bringing another body into captivity. By September, witnesses were unsettled. By October, control was slipping. By November, a wife was writing in fear from inside her own marriage. San Miguel had not yet fully fallen, but the machine was no longer functioning as designed. The girl renamed María Elena Gómez had entered the house in chains. By the end of 1840, the house itself was beginning to move to her rhythm. That is how these records demand to be remembered. Not as gossip, not as folklore, but as a warning. Evil does not only live in the strange woman at the center of the case. It lives first in the system that bought her, baptized her by force, used her labor, and assumed it would never answer for what it had built. If you're listening from somewhere touched by forgotten history, comment your city and country below. Let this record show how far these stories still travel. By October 1840, what had happened on the night of September 15th could no longer be dismissed as an awkward scene at a feast. At Hacienda San Miguel de las Palmas, the disturbance had entered the routine, and once disorder enters routine, it becomes harder to expose, because people begin calling it normal while it is still poisoning them. The first signs appeared in the house itself. María Elena Gómez, brought to the estate in July as an enslaved domestic servant, was no longer confined to cleaning corridors, tending rooms, and carrying trays through the main patio. By the first days of October, she had begun moving inside the machinery of administration. No formal order announced it. Don Cristóbal Mendoza never gathered the staff and declared a change of rank. That would have required intention. And intention is not what the record shows. What the record shows is something more alarming, authority shifting without explanation. On October 3, 1840, a neighboring observer, Doña Carmen Estrada, wrote that the situation at San Miguel had become difficult to understand. Don Cristóbal, once known for direct command, appeared to be losing control over his own employees. The majordomo, Joaquín Herrera, was making decisions without consulting him. And those decisions, again and again, favored the interests of the young black woman who had arrived at the hacienda in July. That is the point where gossip ended and evidence began. The account books of San Miguel, later preserved in municipal records, showed a gradual change in handwriting from October 1840 onward. For years, the entries had carried the blunt, practical hand of Don Cristóbal. Then, little by little, another script emerged, finer, more measured, more elegant. The wording of the entries shifted too. Transactions were no longer recorded with the curt pragmatism of a merchant merely counting profit and loss. The tone became more elaborate, more deliberate, almost persuasive. Someone else had begun touching the nerve center of the estate. No witness ever claimed to have seen an official transfer of that authority. That is what made it so disturbing. The change was not declared, it seeped in. A ledger line altered here, a household instruction there, a purchase approved without the old consultation, a staffing decision made, then obeyed, before anyone stopped to ask who had truly made it. Joaquin Herrera's conduct became one of the clearest signs of the reversal. He was not a weak man by local standards. He had survived years in a plantation world by obeying power and enforcing it downward. Yet by mid-October 1840, testimony began describing him as deferential to María Elena in ways that made no sense inside the strict racial and domestic hierarchy of Veracruz. He listened when she spoke. He acted on her suggestions. He altered assignments at her request, and later, when questioned, he could not explain why obedience had felt so natural in the moment. This is worth pausing over. The great lie of every slave society is that order comes from virtue. It does not. It comes from repetition, fear, and the constant rehearsal of who may command and who must bow. At San Miguel, that ritual order began to fail, not because the masters developed a conscience, not because justice suddenly entered the house, but because they were confronted with something their structure could not absorb. An enslaved black woman who did not behave like property, and men who increasingly reacted to her as though she were above them rather than beneath them. Inside the servants' quarters, the transformation was described more plainly. Remedios Vasquez, a cook who had worked at the Hacienda since 1835, later said María Elena's influence over the household staff did not arrive like a blow. It arrived like water rising little by little. At first, the workers resisted taking instructions from her. That resistance mattered. It proved they still understood the old order. But resistance softened, then vanished. By late October and into November, staff members were following María Elena's decisions without open protest, often without even realizing when the line had been crossed. This is how domination turns inside out. It does not always shout. Sometimes it advances under the cover of habit until everyone inside the system is participating in what they would have condemned a week earlier. Doña Esperanza Mendoza understood sooner than most that this was no passing fascination. She had watched her husband from closer range than the workers or the neighboring visitors ever could. She knew his habits of command, his pride, his vanity, his need to remain master of every room he entered. By November 12, 1840, she was writing in visible alarm that Don Cristóbal was no longer the man she had known. He was spending long hours in private conversation with María Elena, discussing matters of estate administration he had never shared with his own wife. When questioned, he answered vaguely, evasively, as though the substance of those conversations dissolved the moment they ended. That detail should be remembered carefully. A plantation owner who had no habit of treating his wife as an equal in management was now turning repeatedly to an enslaved black woman for counsel. The same society that accepted his authority over hundreds of decisions could not comprehend why he had ceased to exercise it in the approved direction. And so fear spread, not because the house had suddenly become moral, but because power was flowing through the wrong body. By late November 1840, María Elena's place in the house had visibly changed. She no longer moved like a servant waiting to be summoned. She moved as someone who expected space to open before her. Workers looked to her for signals. Minor disputes were brought into her orbit. Household rhythms adjusted themselves around her presence. There is no honest way to describe this without saying what the records imply again and again. The center of command at San Miguel was shifting away from Don Cristóbal, even while he remained physically present. Then came December. Church records from December 1840 show that the matter had escaped the private realm and entered the concern of ecclesiastical authority. Father Antonio Maldonado, who officiated Mass at the family chapel, began documenting irregularities in the conduct of the congregation. During services, laborers directed their attention toward María Elena with a frequency he found intolerable. Some appeared to wait for her subtle approval before taking part in the rituals. Others altered posture or timing after the slightest gesture from her. To understand why this mattered, one must understand the chapel as more than a place of worship. In plantations like San Miguel, religion was another tool of arrangement. It taught the captive to kneel, the wife to endure, the servant to submit, the master to mistake dominion for divine sanction. If that ritual order failed in the chapel, then the disease had reached the symbolic heart of the estate. Father Maldonado was especially troubled by María Elena's bearing. Unlike the others, she did not adopt the expected posture of humility and resignation. She stood upright. She remained composed. The priest described her manner as inappropriately confident, and that phrase reveals more than he intended. What unsettled him was not merely her calm, it was the sight of dignity where the system required abasement. The crisis sharpened on December 24, 1840, during Christmas Mass. That night, María Elena appeared wearing a blue silk gown embroidered with gold thread, a dress that had belonged to Doña Esperanza Mendoza. There was no ambiguity. This was not a borrowed shawl or some accidental exchange of garments. It was a visible occupation of rank. When questioned, Don Cristóbal himself said he had authorized María Elena to wear his wife's clothing. Doña Esperanza was reportedly stunned, and she had reason to be. In a house like San Miguel, clothing was not decoration, it was hierarchy made visible. To place an enslaved woman in the wife's silk at Christmas Mass was not a whim, it was an announcement, whether the man making it understood that or not. 3 days later, Doña Esperanza wrote in anguish that her husband had made the decision without consulting her and seemed to look at her questions as if they were absurd. She wrote that it was as though he had forgotten that a natural order existed in things, as though the years of their marriage had been erased. There, in the last week of December 1840, the outline of the coming inversion stood in full view. The servant had crossed into administration. The staff obeyed her. The priest feared her effect on ritual. The husband deferred to her, and the wife, still alive, still lawful, still present, was already being displaced inside her own house. Remember what this means. Before San Miguel became a scandal, it was a slave estate that believed hierarchy could never betray its owners. But by the end of 1840, the estate had begun to answer for its own corruption. The woman they had bought in July had not simply adapted to the house. She had entered its structure, reached its nerves, and forced every person inside it to reveal what they truly were, when fear changed sides. By the end of December 1840, the disorder at Hacienda San Miguel de las Palmas was no longer something that could be blamed on whispers, nerves, or the imagination of offended women. It had taken visible form. It had crossed the threshold from rumor into replacement. The Christmas Mass of December 24th was the moment the house stopped pretending. The family chapel stood lit in the old colonial style, candles throwing weak gold over stone walls and polished wood, over servants lined at the rear and the Mendoza family seated where rank required them to sit. The ritual should have restored order. That was one of religion's oldest jobs on plantations, to make hierarchy appear holy, to train the broken to kneel, and to let the powerful imagine that ownership had God's approval. But that night even the chapel failed. María Elena Gómez entered wearing a blue silk gown embroidered with gold thread, a dress known by everyone in the household to belong to Doña Esperanza Mendoza. That detail cannot be softened. In a house ruled by rank, clothing was law made visible. Silk was not fabric, it was status, it was bloodline, marriage, whiteness, property, authority. For an enslaved black woman to appear in the lawful wife's dress during Christmas Mass was not a social mistake. It was a public violation of the house itself. Father Antonio Maldonado saw it and questioned it at once. Don Cristóbal answered with a composure that only made the scene more obscene. He said he had personally authorized María Elena to wear his wife's garments. Not borrowed linen. Not a shawl in haste. His wife's dress, on Christmas Eve, inside the chapel. Doña Esperanza's shock was immediate, and it was justified. 3 days later, in a private letter to her confessor, Father Miguel Sandoval, she described her husband's decision as if it had come from a man who no longer recognized either duty or memory. She wrote that he had not consulted her, had offered no reason, and had looked at her objections as though they were childish interruptions. That is how humiliation operates in houses built on domination. One day it points downward toward the enslaved. The next day it turns, and the wife who accepted the system learns too late that cruelty does not always remain obedient to its first target. The church records would later call the weeks that followed the period of inversion. That phrase deserves to be remembered, not because it is poetic, but because it is exact. Between late December 1840 and January 1841, the hierarchy at San Miguel did not merely weaken. It reversed itself in plain sight. At family meals, María Elena began occupying the seat traditionally reserved for Doña Esperanza. Workers who would once have lowered their gaze before the señora of the house now addressed María Elena with the honorific Doña. The old title did not disappear in one dramatic act. It faded through repetition. Fewer references to Doña Esperanza. More deference to María Elena. One altered custom after another until the household began to behave as if the lawful wife had already been erased while still alive. That is the true obscenity of this stage of the case. Doña Esperanza was not dead. She had not abandoned her marriage voluntarily. She was displaced in her own house while her husband stood by, as though the destruction of her place were a minor domestic adjustment. Joaquin Herrera, the major domo, later described those weeks with a phrase that should disturb anyone who has ever watched an institution rot from inside. He said things happened naturally, though afterward nothing made sense. That is how evil often advances, not always with screams, sometimes with smoothness, sometimes with the terrible ease of people accepting what should have stopped them cold. Orders now came through María Elena and were obeyed without open resistance. Kitchen assignments changed, deliveries were rerouted, access to certain rooms narrowed, visitors were received under new rules, household staff adjusted to her authority, not because they had all formed one clear intention, but because by January 1841, obedience had become a reflex around her. Hours later, some could not explain why they had complied so readily. In the moment, it felt reasonable. Later, it felt impossible. This pattern must be marked carefully. The collapse of order at San Miguel did not come because justice finally arrived for the enslaved. There was no awakening of conscience in the Mendoza household. The system remained what it had always been: brutal, racialized, parasitic. What changed was the direction of command. And because that command now flowed through the person the system had intended to own, everyone who depended on hierarchy suddenly discovered fear. By the first days of January 1841, Don Cristóbal Mendoza was no longer merely distracted. He was altered in a way that witnesses struggled to describe. He did not rage when challenged. He did not defend his choices with the arrogance expected of a plantation owner. Instead, he drifted through disputes with a kind of vacant certainty, as though the arrangements now governing his house required no explanation. When servants hesitated, a look from María Elena often proved enough. When Doña Esperanza objected, her husband responded as if she were invoking memories that belonged to another man. She tried to hold her ground. The records do not suggest some melodramatic collapse. They suggest something more painful, a wife fighting to be recognized inside a marriage that was being emptied in front of her. She reminded Don Cristóbal of their years together. She challenged the changes in seating, dress, household command, and access. She appealed to memory, to religion, to custom, to the very rules that had once protected her station. But the rules were no longer protecting anyone. They had already been breached by the same household that created them. On January 12, 1841, Doña Esperanza left Hacienda San Miguel and went to stay at her sister's residence in the port of Veracruz. The parish register recorded her arrival with only a personal maid and very little luggage. That detail matters. A woman of her status did not normally leave her husband's estate in that condition unless something fundamental had broken. She did not depart as a mistress of the house making a temporary visit. She departed like someone pushed out of her own life before the legal forms had time to catch up. From Veracruz, she wrote again to Father Sandoval. Her words were not theatrical. They were colder than that. She said she no longer recognized the man she had married. She said Don Cristóbal lived as if she had never existed. And when she spoke of their years together, he looked at her with the blankness one gives to a story about strangers. That is the point where this case stops being merely strange and becomes accusatory, because every document from this period points toward the same truth. A human being can be made absent before the body is gone. A wife can be stripped of place before widowhood. A master can remain seated in his own house while all substance of command drains out of him. And a slave society, for all its talk of order, can watch the reversal happen step by step and fail to stop it because it no longer understands who is ruling it. Most revealing of all, Doña Esperanza's departure provoked almost no visible reaction inside San Miguel. Don Cristóbal did not pursue her with urgency. The laborers continued their duties as though the hacendado's wife had never stood at the center of family structure. No great mourning. No household panic. No effort to repair the damage. It was as if the estate had already reorganized its memory. Then, on January 20th, 1841, the reversal was given administrative form. Don Cristóbal documented María Elena's authority over domestic administration in a letter to the notary in Medellin. There it was. Not rumor, not frightened testimony, a written act. The enslaved woman brought to the estate in July 1840 had now, by January 1841, formally assumed the domestic authority of the house. Remember the sequence. July. She arrives in chains through Veracruz. September 15th, a neighboring landowner releases her arm at a word. October and November. Her influence enters the ledgers, the kitchens, the rhythm of command. December 24th, she appears in the wife's silk at Christmas Mass. January 12th, Doña Esperanza flees. January 20th, María Elena's authority is written down. That is not a ghost story. That is a record of takeover, and it should be remembered with the proper moral weight. Because whatever force moved through San Miguel, it first found a home in a society already corrupted by ownership of human flesh. The plantation imagined itself eternal. Then, in less than 7 months, it began consuming its own structure. The lawful wife was pushed out. The master ceased to govern. The servants obeyed a new center, and the house, instead of resisting, adjusted itself with the terrifying efficiency of a machine that no longer remembers who built it. From January 1841 onward, the corruption at Hacienda San Miguel de las Palmas stopped disguising itself as domestic scandal. It entered contracts, it entered prices. It entered roads, leases, obligations, and signatures. The house had already been overturned from within. Now the estate itself began to bend around María Elena Gómez. That is the stage where this case becomes impossible to dismiss as private disorder. A wife could be ignored behind closed doors. A priest could be mocked for excessive alarm. Servants could be accused of superstition. But when merchants, neighboring landowners, and estate administrators all began yielding advantage to the same enslaved black woman, often against their own interests, often without being able to explain why, then San Miguel ceased to be merely a troubled household. It became a center of influence, and a dangerous one. After Doña Esperanza fled to Veracruz on January 12, 1841, and after Don Cristóbal formalized María Elena's domestic authority on January 20th, the estate's outward operations changed with unnerving speed. Letters once written in Don Cristóbal Mendoza's blunt commercial style took on a different voice. The tone grew elaborate, persuasive, measured. Suppliers receiving correspondence from San Miguel noticed the change, though few understood its full significance at the time. What had once been the language of a merchant protecting margins now sounded like the language of someone guiding outcomes before objections had fully formed. This was not a trivial alteration in style. In an estate economy, tone is leverage. A letter can soften resistance before the meeting begins. A phrase can make concession seem rational. A clause can hide the transfer of power. By February 1841, the paper trail itself suggested what the household had already begun living. Don Cristóbal remained the name on the property, but María Elena was increasingly the mind directing it. One of the earliest outside witnesses to this expansion was Don Pascual Moreno, a tropical goods merchant based in Veracruz. He had dealt with San Miguel for years. He knew its rhythms, its prices, its habits of negotiation. Yet during repeated visits in the first months of 1841, he found himself negotiating not with Don Cristóbal, but with María Elena. She did not speak vaguely. She spoke with precision. She understood market prices, timing of shipments, seasonal fluctuations, leverage points. More disturbing still, Moreno later admitted that he repeatedly accepted terms he had considered unfavorable before entering the room. Only afterward did the unease settle in. Only afterward did he begin asking why he had yielded so much so easily. This pattern would recur. The estate's contracts in the first half of 1841 began to favor San Miguel with increasing boldness. Land leases included clauses more advantageous than neighboring owners would normally accept. Sales agreements tilted in Mendoza's favor. Labor arrangements reflected a sharper, more deliberate grasp of profit than the already hard practices of the region. Those who later reviewed the documents did not describe a chaotic administration. They described an effective one. That may be the darkest detail of all. Whatever force had overtaken San Miguel, it did not produce disorder first. It produced efficiency. There is a moral lesson in that, and it should not be missed. Wicked systems often admire competence more than conscience. A plantation could forgive brutality. It could even praise it. What unsettled the region in 1841 was not that San Miguel had become more ruthless. It was that ruthlessness had begun flowing through the one person the system insisted should remain powerless. In March 1841, A neighboring landowner named Don Florencio Aguilar met with Don Cristóbal and María Elena to discuss the sale of a strip of land between their properties. It should have been a routine negotiation. Aguilar knew the value of the parcel. He knew the local market. He knew the usual posture Don Cristóbal took in property matters. Yet the meeting ended with Aguilar accepting a price well below market value. Later, writing to his brother-in-law in Xalapa, he admitted that the terms had seemed perfectly fair at the time. Only afterward did they become incomprehensible to him. That phrase appears again and again around San Miguel during 1841. It seemed reasonable then. It made no sense later. A road dispute in June would show the same pattern in even clearer form. But before that, the religious order at San Miguel gave way as decisively as the commercial one. On April 14, 1841, during Sunday Mass, Father Antonio Maldonado documented what he considered the last major breach he could tolerate inside the Hacienda chapel. María Elena had already been receiving unusual deference during services since late 1840, but by April her conduct had become openly presumptuous in the priest's eyes. She answered prayers before the congregation. She assumed postures normally reserved for those of higher social rank. She behaved not like a penitent servant, not even like a tolerated irregularity, but like a center around which the ritual itself was forced to adjust. Father Maldonado confronted Don Cristóbal privately after the service. The conversation lasted more than an hour. It went nowhere. What the priest found most alarming was not defiance. It was incomprehension. Don Cristóbal insisted he had observed no impropriety. He seemed genuinely surprised by the concern. A man who had once understood every line of decorum, every visible marker of hierarchy, now failed to discern even the most blatant reversals. This is an important distinction. A tyrant who knowingly violates order is still mentally present. Don Cristóbal no longer appeared fully present. That was what frightened the priest. By the first Sunday of May, 1841, Father Maldonado suspended Mass at the chapel altogether. This was no small act. In rural Veracruz, the suspension of religious services at a hacienda signaled isolation, contamination, public disgrace. The priest effectively declared that the spiritual and social conditions at San Miguel no longer allowed proper Catholic worship. That meant the breakdown was no longer a domestic secret. The estate had become suspect to the wider region. From May into June 1841, San Miguel began withdrawing from ordinary contact. Letters sent there went unanswered. Visitors seeking Don Cristóbal for business found laborers claiming he was unavailable. Commercial communication narrowed. The hacienda functioned, but like a place turning inward, less accountable to the networks that had sustained it. Such withdrawal is common in corrupted institutions. Once scrutiny rises, the system closes ranks around the new center of power, and still, those who entered the estate often left having conceded more than they intended. On June 15, 1841, Don Rafael Jimenez, administrator of Hacienda El Progreso, south of San Miguel, arrived to resolve a dispute over a road crossing both properties. He expected to meet Don Cristóbal. Instead, he was received by María Elena in the main office of the house. That detail alone was an outrage by the standards of the time. An enslaved black woman, once assigned to domestic service, now receiving a neighboring estate administrator in the principal office to discuss legal questions of land use. But the greater shock came during the conversation itself. For 2 hours, María Elena spoke with detailed understanding of rights of way, property usage, and the legal implications of the dispute. She guided the discussion, she framed the options, she brokered the settlement, and by the end, the agreement favored San Miguel. Don Cristóbal was present the entire time. He said almost nothing. Jimenez later described him as a silent figure seated through the negotiation like an invited witness rather than the proprietor of the estate. On the few occasions Jimenez tried to address him directly, Don Cristóbal redirected the matter to María Elena, saying she had full authority to decide. Remember what that means in June 1841. Don Cristóbal Mendoza was not locked away. He was not publicly declared ill. He was not absent from the room. He sat there, alive, titled, lawful owner of San Miguel, while another person exercised the mind of the estate before his eyes. He did not resist. He ratified it with nods. By then, San Miguel was no longer merely inverted. It was possessed by a new administrative order. The wife had been displaced. The priest had withdrawn. The merchants were yielding. The neighbors were signing away ground and leverage. The master still occupied his chair, but authority no longer lived in him. And here again, the deeper accusation must be preserved. The surrounding world did not suddenly object because justice had been denied to the enslaved. It objected because the wrong person had become effective. A slave society will often tolerate horror as long as hierarchy remains intact. It panics only when hierarchy fails to obey its own script. That is what unfolded through the spring of 1841. María Elena did not simply remain at San Miguel. She expanded. She moved from household command into trade, law, and regional influence. Men accustomed to owning outcomes found themselves surrendering them. Priests accustomed to blessing order found themselves suspending worship. And at the center of it all stood the original crime the region had tried to forget. In July 1840, they purchased a young black woman as property. By June 1841, that same woman was deciding land disputes while the owner watched in silence, like a guest in a house that no longer belonged to him. By July 1841, Hacienda San Miguel de las Palmas had passed beyond scandal and entered the territory of formal alarm. The wife had already been displaced. The priest had already suspended Mass. Don Cristóbal Mendoza still occupied the house, but not as its governing mind. María Elena Gómez, brought there in chains in July 1840, now stood at the center of an estate that no longer responded to ordinary authority. What had begun as a private collapse inside one household was now becoming a matter for church and civil power. The second week of July brought the first direct attempt to confront what San Miguel had become. Doña Esperanza Mendoza returned to the hacienda from Veracruz not alone, but accompanied by her sister Doña Beatriz Estrada and her confessor, Father Miguel Sandoval. The stated purpose was respectable enough to determine whether any reconciliation with Don Cristóbal remained possible, and whether his soul, or at least his judgment, could still be reached. But beneath that purpose was something harder. Doña Esperanza was not returning as a hopeful wife. She was returning as a witness to her own erasure. The meeting took place in the principal salon of the house, the very room where family standing, legal order, and male authority had once been displayed without challenge. Now the arrangement itself exposed the infection. Don Cristóbal received his wife with faultless courtesy, the sort of polished politeness a host extends to a tolerated visitor. There was no tenderness in it, no recognition, no trace of a husband recovering himself at the sight of the woman with whom he had spent 15 years. When Doña Esperanza spoke of their life together, of their marriage, of the years that bound them, he answered as if she were recounting episodes from another man's history. That detail should not be romanticized. This was not forgetfulness in the gentle sense. This was dispossession in plain sight. A wife stood before her living husband and found that memory itself had abandoned the contract that once gave her place in the house. Father Sandoval watched closely, and what he observed made the meeting worse. María Elena did not dominate the exchange with speeches. She barely spoke. That silence mattered. Don Cristóbal kept turning his eyes toward her before answering his wife, as though his own words needed clearance. More than once, according to Sandoval, he altered his reply after catching one of María Elena's subtle gestures. No shouted command, no visible coercion, just the sickening sight of a man of property, a husband, a landowner, measuring his own speech against the smallest movements of the woman he had purchased as property a year earlier. The meeting ended without reconciliation because there was no husband left to reconcile with. 3 days later, Doña Esperanza wrote what may be the most damning line in the whole affair. Don Cristóbal was physically present, but it was as if his essence had been taken and replaced. She was not speaking like a woman indulging melodrama. She was recording a fact as she had come to understand it. The body remained. The man did not. Father Sandoval stayed on 2 more days. That decision changed the course of the case. His report, dated July 20th, 1841, described conditions he considered hostile to the natural and Christian order. The laborers at San Miguel, both those who had come with María Elena and those who had served the estate long before her arrival, treated her with a kind of deference he could neither justify nor penetrate. They avoided direct eye contact with visitors. They answered simple questions with evasions or long silences. They behaved less like workers under discipline than like people acting within a closed system whose logic outsiders could no longer enter. Then came the observation that forced the matter out of the household and into formal inquiry. On the night of July 19th, Father Sandoval, from his room in the guest quarters, watched María Elena move through the main house before dawn. She entered several chambers one by one and remained inside each for a few minutes. After she left, the occupants emerged into the corridor and stood perfectly still. Not asleep, not collapsed. Awake, standing, gazing toward the central courtyard, motionless for stretches the priest estimated at 15 to 30 minutes. They did not react to sound, to changing light, or to the ordinary disruptions of a house at night. They appeared conscious, but emptied of private will. That image should be held in memory, not because it flatters superstition, but because it reveals how far San Miguel had decayed. A plantation already built on forced obedience had reached a condition where obedience itself no longer looked human. This report reached the authorities in August 1841. The mayor of Medellin, Don Antonio Vasquez, acting under direction from the governor of Veracruz, opened a formal investigation into disturbances of public order and possible conduct contrary to Christian morality at Hacienda San Miguel. The inquiry would last 3 months and produce a dossier of more than 200 pages. That alone is proof enough that the matter had ceased to be gossip. Civil power had been forced to admit that something at San Miguel had exceeded the tolerance normally granted to cruelty, hierarchy, and private abuse. As testimony accumulated in August, a wider pattern emerged. María Elena's influence had not remained inside the estate walls. Merchants, tax officials, minor administrators, and neighboring landholders all reported similar aftereffects following contact with her. Confusion, disorientation, gaps in memory, decisions made against their own interests that had seemed perfectly reasonable in the moment and absurd only later. One tax collector, Don Esteban Morales, admitted that he had granted San Miguel a substantial reduction in fiscal obligations and afterward could not clearly recall why. Others gave similar accounts. This is where the case exposes the larger moral rot of the region. The same society that tolerated slave labor, forced baptism, and household tyranny now recoiled because its own officials were no longer certain they were acting freely. It was not justice that stirred them. It was self-preservation. The inquiry also documented physical changes among those who had remained longest under María Elena's direct influence. Workers at the hacienda appeared thinner, paler, and strangely drained despite the tropical climate and the constant outdoor labor that should have hardened them rather than hollowed them out. Their movements were sluggish yet unnervingly coordinated, as if they all followed an internal rhythm not native to their own bodies. To assess this, Dr. Hernando Aguilera of Medellin was called in. He had already visited San Miguel several times during the early months of 1841 to examine laborers suffering extreme exhaustion. By late summer, his findings were more disturbing. Their pulse was slow but regular. Their pupils remained unusually dilated. Their attention seemed limited to immediate tasks, as though foresight and recollection had both narrowed. Most alarming of all, they showed little response to pain. Pressure on joints, palpation of sensitive areas, the usual procedures that provoke discomfort in any healthy person produced almost nothing. Dr. Aguilera could not fit the condition to any ordinary disease. September 1841 brought the inquiry to its center. Authorities summoned María Elena to appear before the mayor of Medellin and answer for the disturbances surrounding San Miguel. Don Cristóbal accompanied her, but his presence only deepened official suspicion. María Elena answered directly, fluently, with a grasp of legal and administrative matters that exceeded many rural proprietors. When questioned about the altered conduct of the workers, she offered explanations that seemed coherent while spoken, yet later appeared contradictory when written down and reviewed. Again, the same pattern. Immediate persuasion, delayed confusion. Throughout the interview, Don Cristóbal remained silent for long stretches, watching María Elena too often, too closely. When the mayor directed questions to him about his own estate, he repeatedly asked that she answer in his place. By then, the authorities no longer needed rumors to understand what had happened. The legal owner of San Miguel had become a spectator to his own authority. In October 1841, the bishopric sent Father José María González to observe the hacienda directly for a full week. His report only sharpened the crisis. He concluded that María Elena's presence disturbed the ordinary bonds between people in ways he could not attribute to normal causes. More startling to him was her knowledge. She discussed Catholic doctrine far beyond what anyone thought possible for a woman of her background. She quoted Latin biblical passages. She moved through theological arguments with an ease that left the priest astonished and suspicious. And there the record leaves us at the edge of intervention. By October 1841, San Miguel was no longer merely inverted. It was under scrutiny from church, medicine, and civil authority at once. The wife had borne witness. The priest had watched the corridors at night. Officials had begun assembling depositions. Doctors had examined bodies that no longer reacted like ordinary bodies. And at the center of all of it stood the original crime no one should forget. A black girl stolen into bondage in July 1840 had been placed inside a house built on domination, and by the autumn of 1841 that house, that estate, and the men who claimed to rule it were answering for a corruption they themselves had first invited in. By early November 1841, the case of Hacienda San Miguel de las Palmas had moved beyond private fear, beyond clerical alarm, beyond the embarrassed language of men trying to protect their class while admitting that something had broken inside it. Church authorities had filed their observations. Civil officials in Medellin had assembled depositions. Physicians had examined workers whose bodies no longer responded like ordinary bodies, and all of them, in different words, had come to the same unbearable conclusion. As long as María Elena Gómez remained at San Miguel, the estate did not belong to its owner. So the order was given. On November 5, 1841, just after sunrise, a small party of armed municipal officers arrived at the hacienda under the authority of Mayor Antonio Vázquez of Medellin. With them came a clerk, 2 witnesses from neighboring properties, and Father José María González, who had already sent warnings to the bishopric the month before. Their stated purpose was simple on paper: remove María Elena from the estate and place her under supervised custody pending further review. But the paper language hid what the moment truly was. This was not an arrest in the ordinary sense. It was an attempt to cut the estate loose from whatever had been feeding on it for more than a year. The officers entered through the front courtyard and found the household already awake. That detail matters. No one had rung alarm bells. No messenger had arrived ahead of them. Yet laborers stood in the yard in silent rows as if expecting the intrusion. Domestic servants waited beneath the arcades, hands folded, faces empty. No shouting, no panic, no confusion, just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes a place feel prepared for violence before violence begins. María Elena emerged from the main corridor wearing a plain dark dress, far less elaborate than the silks she had worn during the period of open inversion, but carrying herself with the same composed authority that had unsettled priests, merchants, and landowners alike. Witnesses said she did not ask why the officers had come. She looked at them as though she had already measured the day and found nothing in it to surprise her. Don Cristóbal Mendoza appeared moments later. If anyone expected the lawful owner of San Miguel to protest, to invoke status, to resist the removal of the woman who had reordered his entire estate, that expectation died quickly. He seemed disoriented from the first moment. He looked from the officers to María Elena and back again like a man who had awakened in the middle of a trial without understanding who was accused. When Mayor Vázquez stated the order, Don Cristóbal reportedly asked twice what offense had been committed and why strangers were speaking of San Miguel as if he were not master there. That reply is revealing. Even at the edge of collapse, he did not speak with outrage so much as bewilderment. He was not defending authority he still possessed. He was groping for a reality that had already slipped from him. Father González stepped forward and insisted that María Elena must leave at once. For the first time that morning, the laborers reacted. Not with rebellion, not with an attack, with movement so synchronized it frightened the witnesses more than open violence might have. Several stepped inward at once, as if drawn by one silent signal. Their bodies formed a partial barrier between the officers and the woman they had once worked beside as another captive. Their faces were not contorted with rage. They were blank, heavy, obedient. The officers raised muskets. Mayor Vázquez ordered the laborers back. Then María Elena spoke. No witness ever recorded her exact words the same way, but all agreed on the effect. She addressed the workers calmly. She told them to stand aside, and they obeyed at once. That single moment condensed the entire horror of San Miguel into one image. The estate had once been built on coerced labor enforced by white authority. Now armed officials stood ready for bloodshed, and the only command that truly governed the workers came from the enslaved black woman they had supposedly watched rise beyond her station. The officers were carrying the law. She was carrying the will of the house. They escorted her through the courtyard without chains. That detail, too, was entered in the record. Some later explained it as caution, claiming the authorities feared provoking the workers if they treated her too roughly. Others believed the officers themselves had hesitated before her in ways they did not fully understand. Whatever the reason, María Elena was not dragged like common property. She walked out of San Miguel upright, under guard, while the owner of the estate stood helpless in his own yard. Then the break came. The carriage had scarcely passed beyond the outer gate when Don Cristóbal collapsed. Witnesses described it as sudden and total. He did not stagger slowly. He folded as if something holding him upright had been severed. When they lifted him, he was conscious but disoriented, sweating heavily, eyes wide with the panic of a man who has awakened after missing months of his own life. He began asking where Doña Esperanza was, why strangers were in the courtyard, why the workers were staring at him in such a way. He asked the date more than once. When told it was November 5, 1841, he reportedly denied it and insisted the last clear thing he remembered was the summer before. One should be careful with such testimony. People reshape memory after scandal. They protect themselves. They shorten guilt into confusion. But even allowing for exaggeration, the change in Don Cristóbal was immediate enough that multiple witnesses recorded it in near identical terms. The man who had spent months deferring to María Elena now seemed to emerge from a long interior absence. The workers reacted no less strangely. Within an hour of María Elena's removal, the rigid order of the courtyard dissolved into visible disarray. Laborers looked around as if waking in an unfamiliar place. Several complained of dizziness. 2 women from the kitchen wept without being able to say why. A cane cutter named Esteban Cruz reportedly asked whether the harvest had already begun, though it had been underway for weeks. Others could not account for tasks they had been performing minutes earlier. What had looked like obedience under one center of will now collapsed into exhaustion, confusion, and gaps in memory. Dr. Hernando Aguilera was summoned that same afternoon and found the estate in a condition he later described as post-fever disorientation without fever. The workers were physically drained, pale, tremulous, mentally fogged. Don Cristóbal himself alternated between lucidity and disbelief. He recognized rooms in the house but not recent changes made to them. He demanded to know why certain books and garments were where they were. He asked repeatedly after his wife, as if her absence were a fresh wound rather than a consequence of nearly 10 months of displacement. This is the point where the case turns from domination to aftermath. Because once María Elena was removed, San Miguel did not heal. It sagged. The estate behaved like a body after possession, or after addiction, or after a long moral sickness finally loses its center. Whatever force had bound the household together under her authority, its disappearance did not restore innocence. It exposed damage. María Elena was first taken under guard to Medellín and placed in temporary confinement in a municipal holding house. The records from those first days are thin and contradictory. One clerk described her as composed, almost indifferent. Another said she spent long stretches silent and then answered questions with unnerving precision. Father Gonzalez attempted further examination but reported no confession, no breakdown, no plea for mercy. If she feared what might happen next, she did not show it. And then, just as the authorities seemed ready to push the matter toward a formal ecclesiastical process, the trail went dark. Sometime in mid-November 1841, during transfer between temporary custody and a more secure religious facility near Veracruz, María Elena disappeared. No clean account survives. One report claimed illness during transport. Another suggested intervention by unknown parties. A third hinted that the escort itself had become confused and separated after nightfall on the road. None of these explanations is satisfactory. What remains certain is this. A woman whose presence had bent an entire estate out of shape vanished from official custody before any final judgment could be imposed. By December 1841, the civil case was effectively closed without conclusion. No definitive charge held. No final ecclesiastical ruling settled the matter. The mayor's office preserved the testimony. The church preserved its alarms. But the center of the case was gone. Don Cristóbal never truly recovered his authority. Though he resumed legal control of San Miguel, those who met him in 1842 described him as diminished, older, hesitant, a man permanently ashamed of rooms he could not fully remember inhabiting. Doña Esperanza never returned to live with him as before. Their marriage survived on paper longer than it survived in spirit. In 1843, Don Cristóbal sold the Hacienda at a loss and withdrew from public commercial life. That too should be remembered. The system that once seemed invulnerable was not destroyed by reform, repentance, or justice. It was hollowed out from within and then quietly sold off. The archive itself nearly disappeared. Papers were dispersed. Letters were misfiled. Parish notes slept in boxes. Municipal depositions passed from clerk to clerk until memory turned into dust. Only decades later did fragments resurface. But even in fragments, the accusation remains whole. Remember what began this? Not mystery, not legend. A girl taken in bondage to Veracruz in July 1840, a forced baptism, a false name written over a stolen one. A plantation household certain that power belonged naturally to those who bought and commanded. Then the reversal. The wife erased while living, the master emptied while seated in his own chair, the workers drained into obedience. Priests terrified, officials confused, and at the end, no righteous closure, only a vanished woman and a ruined estate. That is why this case endures, because it refuses the comfort of a clean lesson. Was María Elena a victim who learned to weaponize the system that first devoured her? Was she something darker? Something that found easy shelter in a house already built on domination, vanity, and spiritual rot? The record does not answer cleanly, it only leaves the warning. When human beings build wealth on chains, they invite more than rebellion. They invite corruption into the soul of the house, and once that corruption begins to speak through the wrong mouth, the people who profited from evil suddenly discover they have no language left to command it. If this case unsettled you, subscribe and comment with your location below. Then leave your theory. Was María Elena a victim who turned the system against itself, or something far darker that fed on power, memory, and submission?